as well start it out right. You got the embarrassing part out of the way.
Because of the other mic being somewhere.
We good? Okay. I was gonna say first things first, let's make sure my mic is working, and then it did that, so it's really working. All right, well, welcome you guys. I'm going to preface this with, I've already came prepared, so bear with me in case there are some tears shed, but just make silly faces and then we'll all be okay. Well, as Mike said, welcome, we're glad that you're here. Once a month or once every couple months, we try to have a live testimony, so people who come aren't just watching somebody on a screen who've had a great testimony, but also know that we have work that we're doing here in our community. So I want to thank you for those who are here, new and old. Well, let's get this started. Welcome to Celebrate Recovery. My name is Lailah Severson, and I'm a grateful believer in Jesus Christ who struggles with anxiety, codependency, and growing up in a dysfunctional household. I've struggled with anxiety and fear for as long as I can remember, walking on eggshells for even longer than that. Growing up, I was very close with my cousins and extended family, seeing as my brother and I were always being rushed off to one of their houses seeking escape from my home life. You guys had to sit right in the middle.
You guys still sit calm, so.
Those are my parents, for anyone new.
We're supporting you.
My father was a full-time pastor of a church up in Oregon, where I was born and raised, only having lived in Colorado for close to 5 years now. Crazy to say that, as it feels like forever ago. My mother had a good job working for a hospital at a time and doing publishing, although we were always just above the poverty line. We made just enough to not qualify for those meal help programs at my school, but not enough to not worry about how we were going to get our groceries a lot of the weeks. My father and I got along well enough, though for a long time, I thought he was an enemy living in our home. Just started. And some years later, that perspective would turn to my mother. The reasoning for such this harsh outlook from a child would be just that, a child. Thinking the world was as simple as black and white, never gray. My parents had an even more turmoil relationship with each other, something my brother and I saw daily. From broken bowls and doors that didn't quite work right anymore, to me sleeping in my brother's room on the floor to feel safe whenever the shouting happened. It never got physical, but it was definitely hard for us to adjust to. I could tell which parent was home based on their footsteps and what mood they were in. I often felt anxious and drained as I would make myself adapt to their moods, behaviors, and tendencies, becoming severely codependent and anxious. I describe the feeling of anxiety as this voice in your head that you know is yours, but sounds foreign despite it being your own thoughts. You'll rarely see me at the grocery store without my headphones, not because of rudeness, but because the voice of my anxiety is simply too loud for me to focus, and it helps to get my attention off other people and what they may be thinking of me. I often plan where I'm going to park when I go places, as the feeling of not knowing the parking situation stresses me out beyond belief, even if I deal with it and do it anyway. It's why, between me and my husband, he's the better parallel parker. I can now successfully talk to people on the phone, plan appointments, make errands, etc., provided I rehearse what I'm going to say first. Despite this anxiety and dysfunction of my home life, I was saved at the age of 7 and was very involved in my church. I made this decision after hearing my dad's sermon on hell and how not everyone was going to go to heaven. Naturally, I did not want to follow suit and accepted Christ into my heart. I wouldn't truly know how important this choice was until the age of 15. Being the pastor's kid was its own dynamic. Everyone knew you, but you didn't know everyone. The analogy I use most is that I live in a glass house, and you're still free to make choices and decisions, but everyone can see you, all the time. If you didn't help participate, people noticed, gossiped, pitied. There was always a pressure to participate. Even though I enjoyed it, it would wear on me. Feeling since my parents' expectations of me were so high, so was God's. This resulted in my relationship with God being very hot and cold, resulting in when I began to notice my anxiety and fear were very much a part of me. I became codependent on what others thought of me and was not my own person, but whoever people needed me to be, even if it made me want to scream on the inside that I had an opinion too. I'd be down for whatever it is that other people wanted, because I felt like I had to adapt to their needs and would rarely voice mine. My parents' relationship with one another began to shape how I reviewed relationships. Men were angry and women were manipulative. This resulted in my view of my father being that he was charismatic enough to be a preacher, addressing hundreds on a Sunday morning, to being disappointed and spiteful when he was home. I remember running down the driveway after he had left due to a fight with my mother, fearing he would never come back every time it happened. Feeling if he ever left because of our home life and because of me, my worth would vanish and that I had failed as a daughter, especially the oldest daughter. My view of my mother was a more delicate one, but often poisonous. I let her confide in me about issues with my father, thinking I was helping her, giving her a shoulder to cry on, not realizing it was not my job as their child to save their marriage. Her behavior towards my brother and I made me feel bitter and resentful, causing me to fight back, believing she deserved all of how they treated each other. Our relationship would not begin to improve until later into my adult life. Deuteronomy 5, verse 16 says, "Honor thy father and mother, as the Lord your God has commanded you, so that you may live long and that it may go well with you in the land the Lord your God has given you." I took this verse and I threw it right in their faces and God's, believing I knew better and that they didn't deserve this honor. My relationship with my parents became strained quickly, really showing as I entered my teen years. I would do well in school, but at home I was honestly a crappy person. I was depressed for most of my teenage years and made little effort to not let it control me. I had friends, sure. They were mostly from our church, and ultimately we hung out because our parents were friends. Vulnerability terrified me, so I would be there for them to a fault, but would rarely tell anyone how I was drowning in my emotions I couldn't seem to manage. To be honest, I don't remember much of my elementary or middle school years. Otherwise, I would tell you more stories. I just remember being depressed and angry often. Towards the world, my parents, God, I can tell you I was depressed often, and while it was only for a short time, I did indulge in self-harm. When my aunt found out, she told my parents, and that was a very, very hard conversation. I felt like despite all of these things in my life and the things I was doing for the church and God, he never saw or cared. This lie I told myself often only made my heart harden more. My behavior and attitude would only worsen as my folks sat my brother and I down shortly after a vacation to Colorado and informed us that we would be moving to that little town of Rifle, Colorado that we said we would never go back to. Did I mention that this would be in an RV with the 4 of us and 3 dogs, 2 of which were German Shepherds? Oh, and I also had to share a tiny loft space with my brother, and I don't like sharing. I thought it was crazy to uproot us from everything we knew and had lived with to go start somewhere new. I moved around schools, but nothing like this. They shared that God was calling them, and we had to answer. I honestly thought they were making the biggest mistake of their life, and I told them they should go without me. Boy, am I glad they didn't listen.
Me too.
Me
too.
We lived on my grandparents' property, still in the RV, mind you, while we helped them finish their house up by Harvey Gap. The one benefit I felt at the time was that we would get to see our grandparents again, playing cards, swearing that Grandma was cheating at Monopoly because she kicked our butts at it every time. All of us grandkids know that Grandma is the superior Monopoly player. Again, she may be cheating. I got to re-know my grandpa while we built their home, and it was a joy I needed at the time, even if my grandma and I were picking up after the boys' construction toys often. We all started becoming active at my grandparents' church as a result of this, and seeing as my dad and grandpa were pastoring together, I took an interest in the worship band and something inside me clicked. That's where I was to be. I disappeared into the music and felt like it was my only connection to my Savior and that he heard me. It was this new beginning that God would begin softening my heart very, very slowly. As the months went by of this new life, I began acting out in less obvious ways. through relationships and deceit rather than drugs or alcohol. Bouncing from relationship to relationship, each guy worse than the one before, and lying to my parents constantly to protect those boys. I was young, and I thought I fell in love often, when I was really just terrified to be alone. I already felt so alone deep down in my mind. One of my exes and I were on and off again for a couple of years, mostly because he was an atheist who believed in the world, and me, a child of God, even if I chose not to act like it. It had its sweet moments, but not enough to pass for a solid Christ-centered relationship. My actions came back to bite me, as while I was in this unhealthy relationship, I made a horrible decision. One I highly recommend you don't make if given the chance. And that was losing my virginity and lying to my parents about it for years after, afraid they would disown and never forgive me. Take a water break, look away. I had given everything to these boys except that last part of myself, my purity. It was horrible to say the least, and nothing like the movies. I screamed and cried and felt a part of myself die, as I was now truly too far gone for God to save me. 1 Corinthians 6:20 states, "For you were bought with a price, so glorify God in your body." Mike, I'm sorry I didn't wait for you like I should have. This act would haunt me for years, fearing my own marriage someday would not be blessed because of this choice made out of spite and because I could. While I was often the victim in these bad situations with these guys, I would let these guys make me the victim, too numb to fight back or using manipulation as my only defense. In the year 2021, I met a man who I thought was finally right for me, someone safe, and everyone loved him. He was even in the worship band. But this was far from the reality I had twisted together and told others about. The relationship became abusive fast. One night, I remember band practice coming to an end and him being upset that I had upstaged him during his solo and that I was trash and didn't hold the candle to him as a person or a musician. He was my ride, and during our argument and my one attempt to stand up for myself, he slammed the car door in my face and drove off. I had to get a ride from a friend because of this, and once again, I had lied about what happened to protect him. Manipulation was the favorite game he played, and he was darn good at it. To this day, when I see a car that matches his, I have to coach myself and remind myself that we're safe. It would come out later that he hurt other women too, and often cheated on them as well as me while we were together. Near the end of our relationship, he had invited me to a program called Celebrate Recovery and guilted me into coming with him to help make him a better man. But walking through those doors, I felt something I was foreign to. Hope, a chance. Not for our relationship, but for me. My whole being recoiled as I was not ready to abandon my way of life and doing things, and I ran away the first time I came here. After the relationship ended, I felt guilty about not going to CR, even though he was no longer in the picture. His behavior would haunt me for a long time and only worsened my anxiety as I grew older. Justifying this perspective I created that men were horrible and I never deserved their love even if I was perfect. This would soon be proven to not be true. In the months after our breakup, I was brought to my knees, shattered as this person I put my whole identity in was gone. What was I to do with myself? I was trained to crave his presence and that I was nothing without him. Becoming isolated as I had pushed everyone away, drowning myself in codependency and screaming it was love. This was when the stone around my heart finally cracked and melted away, leaving behind a heart that was beating with life when it had felt still for years. I was at my rock bottom and had no sense of self. I remember in that moment of being truly broken, I felt myself wrapped in the Holy Spirit as I called out, and I heard his response saying, "Now I can begin." Matthew 11:20-30 says, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest in your souls, for my yoke is easy and burden is light." This eventually became my life verse, and one I got tattooed on my arm as a reminder to lean on God and breathe. Jesus gently held my heart while I recovered from myself and this horrible person. It was only because of Jesus and my relationship with him that I made it out of the trap that was my mind and sorrow. I realized that the only one who had made my relationship with Jesus hot and cold was me, as God was there with me through it all, and I was the one who had pulled away. Codependent on other people my whole life, sacrificing the parts of me I cared for most, giving myself away to anyone who showed me love, even if it was false or twisted. I became invested in the world I became invested in the Word, my Bible, like it was my first time reading it, because it felt like it was all I had left. Who else would see my broken pieces and not recoil? Who else would understand the turmoil and anxiety that plagued my spirit? Who else would love me when I didn't even love myself? Throughout this period of healing and a lot of counseling, I had decided that I was done dating. No one was ever serious enough, and I wasn't ready to do it right, especially with myself and the state of my now fragile spiritual life that I was recovering. However, it was at that moment when I had written off dating fully that God brought about his own plan to introduce a godly relationship into my life, even if I thought I didn't want it. I met him through a mutual friend, and we would start to go to Celebrate Recovery again, but only for him, obviously, right? You know, I didn't need Celebrate Recovery. What I began to experience wasn't your average recovery program for drugs or alcohol, but a program where people can heal from anything you can think of and get to the heart of why we are the way that we are. I would come to worship time and open share, but would never talk, never bare my heart to the other ladies in the group. Some Fridays I would even take off and he would go by himself, because again, I didn't need it, I'm here for him. I didn't struggle with things anymore. I got counseling and fixed myself. Turns out, my anxiety was still crippling, and I was subconsciously codependent in my thinking that if I did enough, I could save him from his struggles. I thought I was only coming back to support my partner, but realized I too needed this program. To learn Christians do struggle in life with more than their faith, and that I wasn't crazy for feeling these ways. Matthew 18 verse 20 states, "When 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am with them." I found community, family, people who understand not just what I was going through, but me. My boyfriend and I kept working the program and the steps, and at times it was hard to support him through his addiction and through my own. And there were times when I almost left, thinking I'd be better off sad and single. Now these moments were few and far between, even if they were really hard. But I held true, because I felt God calling me to CR and to this man, and then I was falling in love. Before we even dated, I remember we were talking in my car for hours, him bearing his soul to me, telling me he loved me, and that I was going to be his wife. And as crazy as that sounds, I felt God in return telling me that he was it. He was going to be my husband. I got in trouble for coming home at 3 in the morning that night, but definitely worth the scolding. I mean, who is crazy enough to tell someone they're interested in, not only about who they are as a person, but how broken they are and how much of a sinner they are? Well, we were working the steps. We dated for a year and had touched on the subject of marriage. This became a more frequent conversation as we neared our 1-year mark of our relationship. And yes, I did have a Pinterest board made already. Finally, wow, that's our wedding date. February 19, 2023, he proposed to me, and I said, "If you're pranking me, you're walking home." I hadn't realized I was so in awe that I forgot I still had to tell him yes. That was when his best friend slid down the frozen stairs of that open park, strummed his guitar, and Michael Severson told me he wanted me to be his wife. God continued to bless us as we planned our wedding, started our lives together while staying committed in our recoveries and to CR. In January of 2024, we were appointed by Kate and Lenny to be the new Celebrate Recovery directors, as I had just left the worship band 2 months prior because I felt God's call taking me elsewhere, and this had to be it. We are coming up on our 1-year anniversary as husband and wife, and I've already learned so much about him, myself, and how I want our kids to be raised. Not seeing the same struggles I saw in my parents, but doing everything I could to be different, and not being trapped by my hurts, habits, and hang-ups I'm still working on, while also keeping in mind they did the best they could. Jeremiah 29 verse 11 says, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. Something I never thought I deserved or would see. A future. What was really cool was, as Mike and I's relationship began to blossom, our families merged seemed to be perfectly, and that is the biggest blessing I could ever ask for, and one I never thought I would have. While I am still young, you learn a lot about yourself through recovery and how there's always a reason for everything, as cliche as it sounds. God never wastes a hurt, habit, or hang-up. Everything I have been through in my life and the decisions I've made and of others has led me to this church, my husband, and my love for this ministry and its people. Renewing my relationship with Christ when I thought I myself was too long gone. To any newcomers, take it from the word of a stubborn pastor's daughter that you are here for a reason, even if you feel like you don't need to celebrate recovery. You walk through those doors tonight, maybe not knowing what to expect, but knowing you did because this is the first step. Take it from me, when you think you don't need to celebrate recovery, that is when you need it the most. And doing that by stepping into Christ's care and control. Thank you for letting me share.